environment, consistent with what I think Ms. Reed has been talking about.
Deputy Attorney General Greg Ott. Certainly. So, as was stated, this regulation doesn't disturb or expand existing law. The citation in the regulation specifically points to measures to ensure the requirements of 651.070, which, as Ms. Reed stated, is existing law. This doesn't expand upon it. As Senator Roberson stated, there may be litigation defining what those rights are. Whatever those are not changed by this regulation. And also point back to Senate Bill 225, subsection 9, subsection 2B, places the requirement for addressing the rights, not expanding those rights or disturbing those rights, but addressing those rights that are currently in existence.
So then the model policy has a placeholder here, if I could put it into layman terms, that say don't look to the model policy, look to the law that supersedes the model policy as districts develop their own detailed policy about how to handle these matters, which I'm assuming would be on probably a school basis when you consider facilities, when you consider other constraints. Is that generally accurate?
Deputy Attorney General Greg Ott, that's a fair representation. Yeah.
Would Steve Camero, Ms. Reed, would I be able to go to school on Monday and for some reasons of whatever, and suddenly gain access to the women's locker room by declaring that morning that I prefer the pronoun of she, and I demand to go into the women's locker room or the women's restroom?
Amber Reed, absolutely not. You would not be allowed to do so, and none of our students would be allowed to do so. This goes back to the stated intent and on the record numerous times of the state that this process is done in collaboration with the students' parents or guardians' input, and with the collaboration of school-based staff and personnel, as well as any additional supportive adults that the student's family may invite to that process. So there is no ability for a child to one day decide I would like to have access to a different locker room than I've been using and have that be granted that day. That would require a follow-up, a meeting, a long-term conversation, and ongoing conversations about what are the needs of the child and what are the rights of the student body at large.
We heard some public testimony earlier about sort of this tension between the rights of an individual versus the rights of another individual, and we heard some discomfort from the public around, personally, we heard a story or a personal narrative of being uncomfortable in a locker room. Would those be addressed? Those aren't addressed here, but they're addressed at the district's policy level when they sort of fill in, if you will, this particular box related to 651.070 and access to locker rooms or access to bathrooms.
Yes, I think going back to Mr. Ott's comments, they would need to stay within the lanes, so to speak, of existing state laws. But in terms of the discomfort and those kinds of things that are exhibited by all on any side, whether it's the part of the section under diverse individual or the rest of the students that are using those facilities, that's part of that ongoing conversation where we're looking at what's best for and how do we find a solution that meets the needs of all.
So then going all the way back to the beginning, I have a meeting, my family, myself, trusted individuals at the school, and we make some really important decisions for my son or daughter, and as they work through this. In addition to pronouns and preferred and what I as a parent will allow or not allow based upon the parent rights that are throughout this and the maintenance of those. We would also address, though, basic bodily functions during the school day.
Absolutely.
And that's where this would live on an individual basis.
Yes, and we need to provide children with the opportunity to take care of their physical needs, including being able to use the restroom when they need to. And oftentimes they may have a requirement for locker room usage of some type, a place to change. in order to participate in a physical education class. So those things would all need to be considered in that, throughout that process. Many of the best practice guidelines that we have identified that we hope to be able to follow up to provide to our schools, especially our principals and our building level administrators, are very thorough and comprehensive in terms of helping teams consider each of these components and not leaving something out inadvertently, while wanting to have the best intention of supporting that child and that family, and also considering the needs of their greater student body. These documents and these best practices do an excellent job of sort of facilitating that process and that discussion in a meaningful and intentional way.
And Steve Cambro, and it sounds like, and just correct me if I'm wrong, and taking into consideration the rights of other individuals who may feel uncomfortable in the setting, so this is a balancing act at the school level, and thus far, obviously this has been going on for quite some time. There was an instance that we heard about that maybe didn't go so well, but generally speaking, our schools and school districts doing this fairly well, even sort of absent the requirement to thoughtfully go back through and refine their policies?
Yes, Amber Reed, I think our principals and our school districts are doing the very best that they can to navigate what is a difficult task in terms of that balancing out. Washoe County School District has had a policy that supports these processes in place in their district for over 3 years. And legal counsel for Washoe County School District has reported 0 incidents of any issues with, or complaints of people trying to abuse that policy and access a locker room or a restroom that does not align with their gender identity or expression. I'll also note that this is not new to Nevada. There are other districts and even states across the country that have similar policies, and they have not also had the issues and the many of the fears that have been expressed today regarding the abuse of this type of policy. In contrast, what we see is in terms of safety especially, the biggest safety concerns are when our gender diverse individuals access any restroom at all. And those are the things that we want to take into consideration and really consider in a mindful and intentional way, supporting the safe practices. I'll also note that what is considered bad behavior in a restroom in a school continues to be bad behavior in a restroom or a locker room in a school, regardless of who's using which restroom.
So just Steve Cambro, so I can summarize, nothing in this particular model policy, the proposed language before us, fundamentally changes the law that's been on the books since 2011 regarding access at the school site.
It doesn't change it at all, not in one way.
Doesn't expand it in any, okay. Thank you.
That would be out of the purview of the State Department of Education to do so. Then the final portion, I'll just restate for the record that the department is committed to providing these resources of nationally accepted best practice guidelines and resources to accompany this policy. We've heard not only here, but in previous hearings at the Clark County School District Board of Trustees meetings, which I will highlight as a separate process. Many of our families, I know that the process of regulation development and policy development is confusing, but just to note that we've had 2 separate parallel processes that have been operating. One, especially here in Clark County. Clark County School District has been working with their gender diverse work group over the course of the last 9 months or so. And the Board of Trustees voted last Thursday evening to direct Superintendent Skorkowski's staff to begin to work with stakeholders to draft potential language for that policy. We're on a completely separate and different track as the state. Our policy is not dependent on Clark County School District. In fact, we cannot. The direction of the law requires that the department provide its policy first, and then districts are required to adopt at minimum that policy, but they can expand on that policy. So the requests for us to hold off and let Clark County School District finish their process are unfounded. We're not able to do that. Our statutory obligation is to move forward in developing these regulations in as timely fashion as we can. That being said, we can also not adopt a policy or amend the model policy in favor of guidelines, which was requested both today and throughout the hearings that have been held in the Clark County School District Board of Trustees. We are required to adopt a policy. We intend to support that policy with additional guidelines and resources for our districts and our site level administrators, our principals, and our teachers. I will also note that one of the main requests for a policy has come from our principals. Our principals have come under a great deal of pressure because we hear sometimes we don't need a policy because we're already doing this in schools. What happens then is our principals do the best they can to follow best practices and to implement and provide an environment that's safe and respectful for all of their students. And then when there are challenges to those decisions, our principals lack the backing or a policy to point to that says this is why I did what I did. And they need that protection, and they are the ones that are really pushing and begging us as a state to move forward with the policy so that then districts have that framework and that skeleton from which to develop their own internal policies.
Thank you. Steve Gambrell, I'll just underscore that as well. I've heard from a number of principals, and I think they've made their voice pretty clear as well in the local context as districts are having this discussion about the real urgent need to have some framework and some guidelines in place. I say guidelines, policies in place, if you will. They have the force of district policy in order to support the real on the ground work that needs to happen and that and the support for students. Okay, do you have any final closing thoughts?
I'll just close with the statement that has been referenced to a couple times today in state law. NRS chapter 388.132 states that the legislature will ensure that, quote, the public schools in this state provide a safe and respectful learning environment in which persons of differing beliefs, races, colors, national origins, ancestries, religions, gender identities or expressions, sexual orientations, physical or mental disabilities, sexes, or any other distinguishing characteristic or backgrounds can realize their full academic and personal potential, close quote. I will highlight that the language of Senate Bill 225 expressly requires the Department of Education to amend the model policy to include the requirements and methods for addressing the rights and needs of persons of diverse gender identities or expressions. The requests that we've had to say that we should not be highlighting one group over another, that discussion, the time for that discussion has passed with the passage of Senate Bill 225. The department is required at this point to expressly identify in language in the amendments to the model policy those rights and needs which we have identified through our careful consideration and research that has led to the development of this language.
Thank you very much. I don't have any further questions. And so just a sort of process related, we open up another round of public comment after, within the public hearing, within this agenda item. So we'll open up around, I will do another 3 minutes just so we can move through and ensure that whomever wishes to have their voice may have it heard. And then there's another opportunity for public comment under agenda item 4 when we get there. So thank you, Ms. Reed, very much. And